Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of the seminar committee, the Department of History, University of Delhi. And here today we have with us two special speakers. We have Professor Victoria Haskins and Professor Swapna Banerjee. Uh, Swapna Banerjee is a professor of history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her research lies at the intersection of gender, class, race and ethnicity in colonial South Asia, and it focuses on women, servants, children, fathers, masculinity, domesticity and family. Her book, Men, Women and Domestics, Articulating Middle-Class Identity in Colonial Bengal, employs the lens of employer-servant relationships to understand the construction of national identity in colonial Bengal. Her new monograph, Fathers in a Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India, interrogates the strong connection between fatherhood and masculinity. She is the co-editor of Mapping Women's History in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. We welcome you, ma'am. Victoria Haskins is a professor of history with the School of Humanities and Social Science at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia. She is the former founding director of Kurai Global Indigenous History Centre. As a historian of Indigenous and women's cross-cultural histories, her key research interests are in gender, domestic labour and colonialism. She has held a number of awards and fellowships, including an ARC Future Fellowship, the NSW Centenary of Anzac Commemoration History Fellowship, and Burbage Institute for the Humanities Fellowship. She has authored and edited many books, the latest being Colonialism and Male Domestic Service across the Asia-Pacific and Colonization and Domestic Service, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. Professor Haskins and Professor Banerjee are currently on a fellowship from Australian Research Council and are working on a collaborative research project, Ayahs and Ayahs, the transcolonial servants in Australia and Britain, 1780 to 1945. It historicizes the travelling Indian Ayahs and Chinese Ayahs of the 19th and 20th centuries. They will be giving the talk on What's in a Name, tracing the travelling Ayahs from India to Australia in the 19th century. We welcome you both, and Professor Charu Gupta will be chairing the talk today, and we welcome you, ma'am, too. We should start the seminar.
Thank you. Thank you. So around 45 minutes? Yeah, something like that. 45 to 50 minutes. Is that okay? And then we can have the floor open for questions and answers.
Right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. It's a great honour and privilege for me to be invited here to speak at the University of Delhi. And I'd like to thank the History Department and Professor Charu Gupta, and also Resident Akhil. Thank you very much. I should just say that I am from Australia, and this is my very first time in India. And this is my very first talk at a university in India, so it's very exciting for me. So I'm going to begin by introducing the project, Ayahs and Ayahs, Transcolonial Servants in Australia and Britain, 1780 to 1945. And this is funded by the Australian Research Council, which is the major funding body for research in Australia. It's led by myself, with Associate Professor Claire Lowry as co-chief investigator. She's from the University of Wollongong. And Professor Swapna Banerjee is our international partner investigator. We also have with us on this trip Ms. Shrishti Guha. Shrishti is doing her PhD in history with me at Newcastle, and she's the lead research assistant for the project. And we have a couple of other research assistants as well. It's a great opportunity for us to present today. We are here really in India to conduct research in the archives in Delhi and Kolkata. So we've done quite a lot of archival research for the records in Britain and the records in Australia, but we actually need to see the Indian side of the story about the travelling Ayahs, and so that's what we're here for. And the paper that we're going to give is a methodological piece that Swapna and I are working on as we're kind of developing how we approach some of the challenges of this research. And so I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Banerjee now. Thanks.
Sure. First, I would like to begin by thanking all of you, and especially Professor Charu Gupta and Akil, Professor Raziuddin Akil, for organizing and giving us the opportunity to present our work before the very, very esteemed colleagues and students of Delhi University. So I'm really honored, I'm really happy to share our work. As Professor Haskins has mentioned, that this is our, we are just, this is, in fact, this is our first presentation on this project together. We are working on it. We have looked at various kinds of sources, primarily in England, that's the British Library, and also she has a huge amount of sources that she collected from Australia. This is our modest attempt to explore the archives and collections in India. And that's a challenging task, as several of you pointed out, finding out things and navigating through the rich materials that are here. So we would love to hear any input you have, any directions that you could give, but this is just our very tentative forays into a very vast subject. So the very question, what's in a name, the title of our paper, signal two directions of our presentation. This question allows us to problematize the recording of names of people on the margins and take note of how and under what circumstances the traveling Ayahs entered into the record books of history. But it also compels us to deliberate from the outset on the nomenclature of the subject of our investigation. That is, the Ayah, a relatively new entrant in the long list of domestic service providers in India, is the subject of our study. I will begin with this question, and then Professor Haskins will follow with an outline of a particular story in the records from which we must decipher from the fragmentary traces of personal means clues that might shed light on the life and background of the traveling Ayahs. An Ayah, representing a female caregiver or attendant, is a ubiquitous figure in the contemporary Indian landscape. We know there are so many thousands of Ayah centers that sprang up, and we hear Ayahs in everyday context. The term Ayah, like many other expressions in Indian vocabulary, is derived from a foreign language. It is a variant of the Portuguese word Ayah, A-I-A, meaning tutor or governess, with its roots in Latin, avia, meaning grandmother. The new word Ayah gained currency in European households in the 18th century. Long before the European advent in late 15th century, India had a thriving culture of domestic service stretching back to ancient times. Texts, edicts, Jain and Buddhist literature from as early as the 6th century BCE have records of employing male and female servants. Medieval regional literature from the 14th, 15th centuries referred to female servants who engaged in cleaning, arranging, reordering the household, and running errands such as fetching milk, cleaning up, so on and so forth. There are references to barber women, washerwomen, sweepers or scavengers, personal maids and entertainers who cared specifically for their mistresses. The trend of hiring domestic workers went on unabated through the Islamic empires and reached its apex under the Mughals. Nowhere in these pre-colonial records do we encounter the term Ayah. The Ayah, a specific occupational category, was a new social formation in an urban economy located within the European families. The female domestic workers who worked for non-indigenous employers such as Portuguese, Danish or British households acquired the name Ayah. Women domestics associated with native households were called by various names, depending on the nature of the work they performed. So midwives were dhantris, popularly called dais or dhaimas. A maidservant was generically called Banji, Dasi, Chakrani, Poricharika, Ji, Bua, Bai, so on and so forth. This neighboring population, not surprisingly, were natives of the land. But for the employees of the Dutch and the British East India Company in the early 18th century, most of their caregivers in private homes, taverns, mess houses, and brothels were not members of the native population. They were non-indigenous, enslaved, and free Christian and Portuguese women who came from various Asiatic societies dotting the Indian Ocean littoral. After they got manumitted, they entered the field of the free Christian or Portuguese communities of the settlements and hired themselves as household servants. This early connection of Portuguese women as hired domestic help explains the use of the term ayah for women caregivers in European families. As a prominent example, the Portuguese women's employment as ayahs or nursemaids in pre-colonial European households perhaps explains the portrait of the native nursemaid Joana da Silva, recently acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So this portrait, actually we had our slides, this is the, this is the older version of our PowerPoint. The most recent version did not come through. The woman on the right, she is the Joana da Silva, and you could look her up on Google her and find her magnificent portrait that has been done in 1792 by a British portrait artist called William Wood, and it's been recently acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the location of the ayahs in European households also made them characteristically mobile, a special feature that was not common among maid servants working for native families. As Rosina Vishram, the pioneering scholar who put the traveling ayahs to the pages of history, noted, the ayahs were the chattels of the empire. They were crucial in the imperial landscape, both in the colonies and in the metropole, and numerous records reveal that ayahs were indispensable for raising children in Anglo-Indian households. And by Anglo-Indians, I mean the European officials who were posted in India for official purposes. That was the original use of the term Anglo-India, not in the sense we use it now. So the British mistresses or mem sahibs, they depended heavily on the labor and care of children by Indian maids. The ayahs also hired themselves to mind children during the passage of European or British families and also Indian families to England and back. Vishram wrote, as traveling nannies, and I quote, they formed the most valuable adjunct to the whole lifestyle of the Raj between Britain and India. Ayahs were not only crucial for the Mem Sahib in the colony, and I again quote Vishram, the long trusted family ayah or an experienced traveling ayah was indispensable for the long voyage home. On board, they were in complete charge of children, of the baggage, as well as of the mistress. Good ayahs was not only meant to be clean, trustworthy, and good with children, they were meant to be good nurses and expert sailors as well. So of late, there is a growing body of literature on traveling ayahs, especially between India and the United Kingdom. The focus of our research and our paper today is, however, on those who traveled to Australia. India and Australia were joined at the hip for centuries. Both being colonies of the British Empire, India was perhaps Australia's oldest business partner, and their transactions involved more than goods and services. Laborers in various capacities, servants, bricklayers, carpenters, agricultural workers, small merchants and hawkers were part of the movement between India and Australia. In different contexts, immigrant labor, including from India, was crucial to the colonization of Australia. Note that Australia had been established from convict labor in 1788. Among these varied workers figured the critical but less explored character of the Ayah. Contrary to the prevailing notion that women from South Asia, whether independent or as part of British Indian family, were limited to the Indian Ocean world, our research, as well as that of others, document that many women came as Ayahs accompanying white employers from British India to Australian ports and inland towns. The challenge, however, lies in identifying these individual South Asian women, domestic workers, who traveled between India and Australia in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that is where the problem of naming comes in. I now turn the floor over to Professor Haskins.
Thank you, Swapna. Before I move on, I'll just point out, because we have had a bit of a glitch with the slides, but this little one down here it's the entry page to a online exhibition that we've developed as part of our research project. We intended to actually have a physical exhibition, but COVID interrupted, and we ended up designing an online exhibition. It's like a physical exhibition in that we only have the objects to display for a limited time. We have agreements with different museums. So it runs till early June this year. So, take a note and you can go and have a look at that for yourselves. So the history of Ayahs who came to Australia is almost completely unknown. But our research has found that while their numbers were always very small, we're talking very small numbers of people, there was certainly Ayahs travelling to and from the Antipodes throughout the colonial period, which is the 19th century for Australia, and even after the enactment of the notorious White Australia policy in 1902, going well into the 20th century. And they fall into three kind of groups of workers. So these include servants who are brought into Australia by colonial immigrant families. So you've got British families basically who come to Australia to settle, and they might bring an Ayah with them, particularly if they come from India. Others who come into the country as indentured labourers, but then when they get into the country, they jump. They find employment as domestic workers, and we find them being called and calling themselves Ayahs. And then there's still others, probably the bulk of the ones that we're really looking at, who visit the country for short periods with their sojourner employers. So their employers are not staying in Australia, they go back out again, but they have their Ayahs with them. Now, their names are mostly not recorded in the archives. The general pattern is to record their presence only as the generic Ayah. For instance, a preliminary survey of passengers' records of inbound ships to Australia between 1852 and 1923 that Shrishti's been doing for us lists about 120 Ayahs, but none of these Ayahs identified with their personal names. Rather, they're identified with their employers' last names, who they were accompanying. And up on the screen, you'll see we're displaying a clip from the online National Archives of India. This is an interesting primary source that relates to an Ayah being denied permission in 1905 to come into Australia. Again, there's no name. So it's kind of a telling example of the kind of anonymity, that's a good word, of the Ayahs. So for our paper, we're going to draw on a case from very early 19th century Australia. And I'm going to give you a very brief, very sketchy outline of a story. It's a very lengthy, long story. So this is just a quick outline, but you're welcome to ask us questions for more details about it afterwards. Now this case has left for posterity unusually well documented records of servants who have names and even more unusually have voices. So in 1816, William Brown, a wealthy Calcutta merchant, emigrated to Sydney to settle at the invitation of Governor Macquarie of New South Wales. His wife Sophia, also from Calcutta, joined him in 1818, so 2 years later. Now, both, when they came, were accompanied by a significant number of people from Calcutta. So William brought with him a number of contracted field workers, and Sophia brought with her her household domestic servants, as well as more indentured field workers. Now, at least, we know that at least 6 of their employees, of these household employees, were women. And they also had male domestic workers. Now, while immigration and judicial documents record the names of the women, the spellings of the names were disparate, which caused some confusion as trying to write up this case about their identity and trying to work out who they were and what they were doing. So Brown's plan was to utilise the contracted workers that he brought with him as his labour force instead of convicts. Everyone else was using convicts. He was like, no, I think I can bring these Indian workers and they'll be much better than convicts. I was very enthusiastic about what ideal workers they were. In the middle of 1819, that all changed when William Brown found himself hauled before the Colonial Magistrates Court, defending himself against allegations of mistreatment of his workers. Over a period of 4 days in early July, the bench considered written and spoken depositions from no less than 22 of his employees, attesting to gross abuse and their earnest desire to be freed from their contracts. To his dismay, the magistrates found that his workers had indeed, quote, been insufficiently and ill-fed, unduly worked, greatly aggrieved and unjustly treated, and ordered all of his Indian workers, which were by then some 40 people, to be released at once from his service and returned to Calcutta. They were gone by the end of the month, landing back in India at the end of September, where the Indian government pronounced that the Indian government had now taken precautions to prevent the further embarkation of such persons to New South Wales without adequate security for their good treatment by employers. Now, this story routinely appears in Australian histories of immigration and labour. And historians use this story, we see it over and over again in these histories, to trace the origins of Australia's very well-known aversion to indentured non-white labour, which is the roots of the White Australia policy. It also appears always, as you'd expect, in histories of Indian migration to Australia because it's such an early migration story for Indian people. However, up until quite recently, the episode's only ever been represented as a story of indentured male agricultural labour. It's always about, the classic coolies. So the court case was actually instigated by Brown's household workers, who were the driving force behind the case, and concerned their treatment primarily in the private household. You would not know from the way that the history has been written, nor would you know that there were women involved. And so there were 5 women workers overall who gave depositions, and 3 of those women were enslaved domestic servants to the Brown family. Now, the reason that we know the story, and unfortunately that's way too tiny for you to read it, I will read some of it to you though. The reason that we know about it is because the depositions, which were recorded by hand and are still held in the Colonial Archives in New South Wales, were collated 7 years after the hearing for a very large report on slavery in East India. And that report was presented to the British House of Commons in 1827 and published the next year. Because the 3 women who worked for the Brown family considered themselves and were described as slave girls, and because that they'd asked the Australian colonial governor to, quote, dissolve the bond of slavery in which Mrs. Brown deems them held, these things meant that the case had relevance for the parliamentary abolition debates of this period. And I'm not sure how much work you might already be familiar with that history. So the testimony provided by the three women, as well as others amongst the memorialists, is really compelling. And we can quote from the testimony of the older of the three domestic workers, Thomasy, who stated that she was the ladies' dresser and worked needlework, etc. And so I'll read it to you in my Australian accent, which will be a once in a lifetime opportunity. Mrs. Brown used to beat me most shamefully on the slightest occasion if I forgot to do anything. Mr. John Brown, who was an adult son of the Browns, beat me twice, once with the rattan, then with his hand on my face. He cut my eye, he thrashed me on the steps. I never got any wages nor clothes. Such clothes as I had were given me by Mrs. Brown's friends, 2 suits of clothes. When I did not work, I got no food. I was beat by Mrs. Brown at the farm at the Devil's Back, which is obviously a colonial site. I've been so long with Mr. Brown without wages, and I want some. I have been with him since my infancy. This case is highly significant for us because it gives us an insight into what life was like for women who came to Australia as Ayahs. It also shows the agency of these women who are prepared to stand up to employers who didn't treat them fairly. Now, it's not clear whether they spoke in English or whether they had a translator. The court did appoint a translator for them. She was a woman convict who had been transported from India named Clara Ward. But we don't actually know for sure whether they spoke in their own voice or whether they had a translator. But it's so rare that we have an opportunity to hear their voices, however mediated. Tracing the story, I also found in the Australian colonial records a letter from another Indian domestic who was working for the Browns in 1821, which was after all the others had returned. So this is another woman. Her name, Pearbox or Pearbucks, wrote to her former British employer back in Calcutta, asking for his help to get her away from the Browns, and asking him to help her be freed from her bondage, in very similar terms to the way the women had spoken in the case, a few years earlier. And this letter, which was presumably scribed for her, and you can see it's all in the same handwriting, the signature is in the same handwriting. So I'm sure there was probably a scribe there. But it's a very exciting find for us because it represents probably the very earliest letter that we have from an Indian Ayah in Australia. Now, having said that, the women were never actually described as Ayahs in the records, which perhaps indicates that as yet in the Australian colonies, the word Ayah didn't have real purchase in this early 19th century. But they were clearly domestic workers working as maidservants and child carers, and their records are highly significant for us because here we find the women's personal names recorded because it was a court case, so you're getting the personal names. And so for once we're able to identify historical actors as real people instead of ciphers. However, their names are spelled in so many different ways throughout the file of papers that are held in the archives, and then again in multiple variations in the printed version that came out in the slavery report, that it was very difficult for me to work out who was who initially, and I was finding that I couldn't kind of work out who was the wife of who and who was working here and who was working there. It's a long, there's many depositions. And this multiplicity of naming also occurs in the naming of the field workers who gave testimonies as well, both male and female. And I will make a very brief aside here, which we could discuss later, but it's interesting that the field workers were described in general as dungars, D-U-N-G-U-R-S, which is a very, very early use of the term dangar, which would become synonymous with Indian indentured labourers later in the century. But anyway, I'd spent quite a bit of time collating the various multiple names of all the workers who appeared in the records just to work out who was who and who was connected to who. And once I'd done that, I realised that I had Swapna's extremely rich expertise in colonial domestic work in India, I realised that Swapna would be able to go over these names and help use them as clues to where we can find out about their personal backgrounds and get a bit more of a sense of them as individuals. And so I'll hand back to Swapna now.
Thank you, Victoria. So let us now turn back to the table of names that we encountered. So she has collated the lists of servants. I put them in order of how they appeared. So see the Bo, who's the wife of the field worker Azim. We have no names there, just as Bo. Then Bhakti, a house girl or a slave, we don't know exactly what designation she had. Pierce, a house girl and or a slave. Thomasy, who gave the famous deposition, also noted as a house girl or a slave. Lachwan, the wife of Butcha, who's the washerman, and Perbaks. As you know, someone familiar with Indian spellings, you could always already see the English transliterations of these names at quite odd. Then we have for the 6 female domestic workers who were listed to work under the Brown family. None of their names were spelled consistently. They appear different in different records. The names of the house girl, Bhakti, came in at least 10 different spellings. So you see the different ways Bhakti has been spelled. And the other house girl, Pierce, spelled again in a variety of ways, was also sometimes named as Pari. Thomasy appeared under multiple different spellings. So Victoria's initial suggestion was that Thomasy may have been a Portuguese woman, as we know that the earliest Ayahs were of Portuguese origin. However, I surmise that it is also possible that Thomasy could be an Indian name, not a Portuguese name, and which means Tamoshi derived from the word Thomas, as we all know, because of her dark skin. And she also says that she stayed with the Brown family from infancy, so she may have been an orphan raised to be the servants of the Browns. The 2 younger slave girls, as they describe themselves in their depositions, may also have been brought into the household as little children or babies. Bhakti, who sometimes bore the prefix Bol, could be the sister or other female relations to Thomasy or Hari or Pierce. Hari and Pierce, however, appear to be the same person. Names of servants, especially those of female workers, is always problematic in the South Asian past. For the Ayahs mentioned here, it is understandable that the names were entered on the basis of hearing. The sounds were transcribed as they were pronounced, and the names had no established spellings in English. It is doubtful if the Ayahs could spell or write their own names. The namelessness of domestic workers is persistent in Indian culture. Servants were often addressed by their physical attributes, such as Kalua for a dark-skinned servant, and Kali or Kalodai, who I consistently encountered as a black wet nurse or servant engaged in caregiving. Bo here, indicating the wife of the field worker Azim, is often a generic name given to married women domestic workers. So women domestics were not often addressed by their given names, but were called by their affinal relationships, such as somebody's mother, sister, like Bon Bhakti in the Brown files. Subaltern workers were also named after their physical attributes and deformities that mark social and physical conditions. So the next slide, please. The power of naming established the distance and the authority that the employers wielded over servants. As Nitin Sinha and Nitin Verma reflected, and they quote from them. While servants are required to address every member of the household with respect, their own name would be corrupted, chiseled, and redesigned according to the master's and mistress's will. End quote. The multiple and distorted spellings of entries in the Brown files offer no exception to the general pattern in which the real name of Ayahs or domestic workers is always an issue. So with that, I turn to Victoria for our conclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Swapna. So we know as historians that names are essential clues when we research historical actors, especially when we're researching people who've been marginalised and overlooked. Their names help us to trace the person and establish who they were, what their ethnic, cultural, and religious background was, and also be able to use their names to locate them in place. So one of the things that we find in the Australian records is that they're listed as coming from Bengal, but that's because they're leaving the port of Calcutta. We don't know whether they really do come from Bengal, and if they do, where in Bengal. But names can help us establish that kind of thing as well. They also help us to find other pieces of information about them in the historical record, so we can start to build up a picture of that person. And finally, importantly, they restore a sense of human dignity to those who've gone before us, reminding us that they were indeed real and complex characters with their own hopes, dreams and destinies. The testimonies of Thomasy, Pierce, Buckton and Pear Butts attest to their agency and the strength that they had to fight the injustices they suffered at the hands of their employers in a foreign land. Records indicate that they'd all returned to India by the early 1820s. We don't know what happened to them after they come back. And these are the kind of questions that we're here to find out. So where are people in India? Where are their families in India? Where are they remembered? Do people remember them? You know, where is the significance of the travelling Ayahs in Indian history? So we're here in search of the kind of records that might tell us more about the experiences and lives of these Ayahs, these remarkable women who set sail for distant lands. And so we're very grateful to have been able to share this with you, and we would really appreciate any comments or questions or suggestions or any clues or insights you might wish to share with us that will, you know, help enrich our project. Thank you.
Thank you.